So I come to you actually as a time traveler from the 60s to tell you tales of how student rights was invented and how the law that supported student rights was created and the context in which all that happened. But in order to do that, we have to go back even further and time travel back to, well, the late 18th century here in Philadelphia. My task will be to get from the 18th century to 2018 in less than 3.5 hours. It's not easy. Of course, it was, 231 years ago this summer that the Constitution was written, right around here, in a hot, steamy summer of 1787. And the Constitution, almost didn't get passed. The Constitution that they wrote after all of that time couldn't get ratified by the required number of states because it didn't have a Bill of Rights in it. And it didn't have a Bill of Rights, although the addition of the Bill of Rights was debated. The people who wrote the Constitution decided not to include one, largely because they thought it wasn't necessary. They had what turned out to be a very innocent and naive view of the Constitution. They thought that the Constitution gave the government certain powers, and if it didn't give them other powers, then they wouldn't exercise other powers. That the Constitution was self-limiting in that regard. Why do you need a First Amendment to protect the right of free speech or freedom of religion if the Constitution didn't give the government the power to violate those rights? If they didn't have the power to violate those rights, they wouldn't. Other people were much more mistrustful, and they insisted, no, you had to have a Bill of Rights in the Constitution. And as it turned out, politically, the Constitution would not have been ratified by the required number of states if they had not promised to immediately add a Bill of Rights. They turned out to be the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. And the Constitution and the Bill of Rights is really based, as our country is based, on two ideas. One idea is the idea of democracy, and the other idea is the idea of liberty. And a lot of people think that those are the same. You often hear people say democracy and liberty like it was one word without any spaces or hyphens in between. And it's all sort of the same warm bath of the political culture we live in. But the truth is that democracy and liberty are adversaries. They always have been, and the people who wrote the Constitution very well understood that. Democracy is the idea that people ought to have a say in the decisions that affect their lives, which they didn't have under kingly rule in England or in anywhere else. Democracy is the idea that people ought to be able to vote and determine by majority rule most of the decisions that affect them. And they do so through a system of representative democracy and so forth. But what about the people who get outvoted? Liberty is the idea that not all decisions should be allowed to the majority. Liberty is the idea that the majority doesn't get to decide everything. That just because there are more whites than blacks doesn't mean that whites can deny blacks the right to vote. That just because there are more Christians than Jews and Muslims doesn't mean that Jews and Muslims don't have the right to follow their own religion, or that Christians can outvote them by banning it. Just because men have more political power than women doesn't mean that they can deny women the right to vote, or the right to birth control, or the right to equal shot at education or employment. Now, of course, that's exactly what happened in this country. Despite the Bill of Rights, That's what happened in this country for almost 200 years. But the people who wanted the Bill of Rights, who had this idea of liberty, believed that if the majority, including the Democratic majority, was not limited legally, then the rights of people in the minority, whether it was a political minority, a racial minority, a sexual minority, a religious minority, the people in the minority would have no rights because the majority could vote them down. So you had to have rules in order to guarantee rights that legally prevented the majority from doing certain things. The Bill of Rights is that list of limits. The rest of the Constitution is written positively, in affirmative terms. It says what powers the government shall have. The Bill of Rights is written in negative terms. It says what powers the government can't have. That's why the protection of free speech and freedom of the press and freedom of religion is protected by language which says, Congress shall make no law that abridges those rights. It's a legal limit and a kind of a super law that limits the other laws that the majority can make. All the elements of the Bill of Rights are written that way. One of the things that got the colonists crazy and which really led to the revolution as much as anything else was the practice of British soldiers coming in the late 18th century and tearing up the furniture in people's house and looking through their footlockers to find violations of the Stamp Act or whatever else they were looking for. They could come in whenever they pleased. And the colonists hated that. And many historians believe that the thing that sparked the revolution the most was the anger and the fury over those uncontrolled discretionary searches. So when the revolution was over and the Constitution was written, the Fourth Amendment is written to say, no, you can't do that. No matter how much you need to search for evidence of a crime, you can't come in whenever you please. And you can't come in at all unless you have a good reason to doing so, and unless you know what you're looking for, and unless it's related to providing evidence of a crime. And you can't get to decide that by yourself if you're a policeman. You got to get permission from an independent party called a judge. Every element of the Bill of Rights is written that way. The Constitution says what government can do and grants it powers. The Bill of Rights says what government can't do, even by a unanimous vote of Congress. Even if everybody, or almost everybody in the country wants it, says what the government can't do, and those limits are what define our rights. So democracy and liberty are not only not the same thing, liberty sets limits on democracy in order to protect rights. So for example, if I say I have a right to distribute a leaflet on the street, that means that the cops can't punish me or arrest me for it or stop me from doing it. If I have a right to vote in secret, in the secret ballot, that means that the government doesn't have the power to peek. If I have a right to be secure in my own home and not let the cops in without this very good reason that a judge has approved, that means that they can't come in whenever they please. Every right is defined as a limit on power, including democratic power. Now this was a big struggle in the 18th century. That was what the fight over the adding the Bill of Rights was about. That people who were concerned about the rights of the outvoted were concerned that if you didn't have legal limits on the democracy, people who were outvoted wouldn't have rights. Now this all came out of a time in the 18th century before the Revolution when there was a great mistrust of political power. I grew up at a time when my parents trusted government power immensely. They were working class people who grew up in the Depression, who couldn't find work, and they felt saved by Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal and by all those programs. For them, government was an instrument of help. Government was an instrument of providing benefits. Government was an instrument to provide remedy for economic disaster. So I grew up at a time when it was sort of obvious to trust government. But in the 18th century, that wasn't the case. If you read the pamphlets that were written before, right before the American Revolution, you will find that power is described as an antagonist of liberty, and that the words that they use to describe power are words like treacherous, relentless, devouring, cancerous, predator. Power was seen as a predator, even democratic power. Liberty or rights were seen as its prey. And that worldview is what shaped the way the Constitution was framed and the fight that led to the adoption of the Bill of Rights. Now, of course, they were all just pretty words. The fact that you could write those words down didn't lead to self-execution. As we all know, even the democracy was an improvement over the kingship, but it left a lot of people out. It left blacks out, who were slaves. It left Native Americans out, who were hardly considered human, much less citizens. It left women out, who didn't get the right to vote even until 1920. And it even left most white men out. You couldn't vote in the early years of the United States if you didn't own property. So the democracy was an improvement over the kingship, but it was available to very, very few people. And everybody else was left out. The Bill of Rights was unenforceable. It left out all those people it was meant to protect. And they only applied to the federal government anyway. The Bill of Rights did not apply to state and local governments. But state and local governments is where people lived, especially in the 18th century and the early 19th century. Nobody had any connection to Washington. The federal government was distant and remote. The president didn't affect your life. Even Congress didn't affect your life. Who did affect your life was the local mayor, the local governor, and the local police. And to those people, the Bill of Rights didn't even apply. Even if it had applied, how would you have enforced it? You're out there, you distribute a leaflet, the cop comes along and busts you. Who do you call? There were no Ghostbusters. Who do you call? There was no ACLU. There was no NAACP. So the Bill of Rights was a time bomb. The people who insisted on it knew it was important, but it would not realize its power until way later. At the time that the ACLU was created in 1920, 130 years after the Bill of Rights and the Constitution was adopted, 130 years, the Supreme Court had never once, not once, ever struck down any government action or law on First Amendment grounds. Never. It wasn't just that the Supreme Court was conservative, which it was, and reactionary and authoritarian. It was that those cases didn't even get there, because the people who needed the protection most had no way of getting into court. In 1916, Margaret Sanger was arrested every Monday and Tuesday in New York City for distributing leaflets to women, providing them information on birth control. She was arrested all the time for just handing out leaflets on providing information on birth control. First Amendment wasn't there for her. She didn't know how to invoke it. She couldn't afford to invoke it. There were no lawyers in organizations like the ACLU or any other organization. There were no organizations like that. If you needed a lawyer, you had to hire one who was in private practice. Most of the people who needed rights the most couldn't afford to hire lawyers. And if they could, most of those lawyers wouldn't take their cases because it was bad for business, especially if they were representing somebody who was unpopular for one reason or another. And all of the people who needed their First Amendment rights were unpopular at the time that they needed it. All of them. And they were put in jail and put in prison for disagreeing with government policies. And the First Amendment provided no relief. That began to change in the 1920s and 1930s for three reasons. One, labor unions. Two, the ACLU. And three, the NAACP. All three of those organizations began to provide assistance for people who needed the First Amendment. The labor unions provided it mostly for their own members because they needed the right to meet, the right to organize, the right to hand out leaflets, the right to picket, the right to strike. Those were all First Amendment rights that hadn't been recognized before, and the labor union started to bring in cases into court. The ACLU started to do the same thing, slowly. I mean, the ACLU was, when they were organized in 1920, there were 30 or 40 people. And they decided that they were going to protect the entire Bill of Rights for everybody in the country. They didn't even have a fax machine. They didn't have a budget. They had nobody on staff who was a lawyer. And the courts were not responsive. So the idea that this organization was going to protect the whole Bill of Rights for everybody in the whole country was delusional. And it's the sort of delusion that is always the beginning of social progress. Slowly, these cases began to creep into court, and the NAACP began to bring racial discrimination cases into court. There was no law to protect them. There was no law, there was no reason to think you could win any of those cases, but they started to go into court, and in the 30s and the 40s, case law slowly begins to develop that gives people First Amendment rights. Now, if you fast forward to the 1950s, 1960s, government changes at that point. It's very different from what it was in the 18th century. In the 18th century, government consisted of basically three things: legislatures, the executive branch, and police. And so when the Bill of Rights was meant to set limits on government, it was meant to set limits on the legislatures and the executive branch and police. And when the people who wrote the Constitution said, you got to be careful of power. Power isn't evil, but it's dangerous, especially if it's unrestrained, and you have to have legal restraints or otherwise people won't have rights. They were thinking of the legislature and the executive branch and police. By the 1950s and thereafter, government had become something vastly different. In addition to legislatures, both state and federal, in addition to the executive branches, in addition to cops, government now ran huge social service institutions. There were public schools. Public is an interesting word. It sounds benevolent, but it means government. Say government schools, and that sounds a little different than public schools, but that's what they are, because they are backed by the police power of the state. And you have to go. Compulsory attendance laws come in the early 20th century. They come in primarily to get rid of child labor by making kids go to school. The interesting thing about the compulsory attendance laws is that they're often called compulsory education laws, but they're not compulsory education laws. They do not compel anybody to educate the kids or set any sanctions if they don't. They're compulsory attendance laws. They make kids go, and they take kids away from their parents if the parents don't send them. So you're compelled to attend these government schools. And in addition to the public schools, there are mental hospitals, which are often psychiatric institutions run by the government. There are foster care institutions, children's institutions for runaway kids or kids who are acting out or kids who have no families or dysfunctional families. There's public housing, government housing. There are all these, and of course there's prisons in abundance. In the 1920s, all of these institutions start to grow. And they grow primarily because of people who call themselves progressive. The 1920s was the last time, besides these times, in which there was a serious movement calling itself progressive. And what did progressive mean in the 1920s? It meant that government was not only to pass laws in legislatures or to arrest people if they committed crimes, that government was there to do good for people. And the people who passed these laws created the public school, they created compulsory attendance laws, they turned insane asylums, consider the language, they turned insane asylums into what they called mental hospitals. Hospital is a term that implies you're sick, you go there to get care, and you get out when you're better. You go there to get well. So now the insane asylum was no longer to be a place where people were incarcerated and warehoused because they behaved erratically or because they were dangerous to themselves or others. It was now a place where people went who behaved bizarrely or for any number of reasons, and they went there to get well. They weren't insane asylums, they were hospitals. Even prisons, this happened to. Prisons were no longer prisons, now they were penitentiaries. Think of what that word means, penitent. That's where penitentiary comes from. It means you were going to be penitent, regret what you did, say you were sorry, and get rehabilitated. Prison was no longer a place for punishment, it was a place to get help. It was a place to take people who had misbehaved and make them well. These were all progressive institutions from the left side of the political spectrum. And because they were providing benefits for people, because they were helping people, nobody thought of them the way you think of cops. Nobody thought of them the way the colonists thought of political power, as dangerous. Nobody thought that they need to be restrained by rights. Nobody thought, well, what about the rights of the clients of these institutions? What about the prisoners? What about the people in these mental hospitals? Orphanages became reform schools. Schools, reform, places where kids could go to get better, like hospitals, like mental hospitals, like penitentiaries. Everybody was going to be improved by the rehabilitation that went on in these institutions. And so nobody thought of these places as evil or as necessary to restrain. And nobody thought of the rights of the clients of those institutions because nobody thought of limiting the power of the people who ran them. Because they meant to do good. And they meant well. When you get to the 1960s, all kinds of stuff is going on in our society. The civil rights movement is in full flower. There's a lot of resistance to the war in Vietnam. But mostly the civil rights movement provides a kind of a baseline for other people. And all of a sudden, the clients of these institutions start everywhere. It happens with students in high schools, even in elementary schools. It happens with mental patients in the state institutions. It happens with prisoners. It happens with kids in foster care and reform schools. Everywhere, the clients of these institutions start to say, well, what about us? Do we have the right to criticize the principal of the school, or the prison warden, or the chief psychiatrist in the mental hospital? Do we have the right to meet and organize and distribute leaflets? Do we have the right to subscribe to magazines that the prison warden or the head psychiatrist in the hospital doesn't like? Do we have the right to distribute a leaflet outside of our public school that the principal doesn't want us to distribute? And if we get punished for all this, who punishes us? What process is there? Do we have the right to a hearing? Do we have the right to bring a lawyer to that hearing? Do we have the right to tell our side of the story before a neutral decision maker? No. The principal of every high school in America is the guy who charges you with the misdeed, who hears the case, and who renders the verdict. There's no jury, there's no judge, there's no prosecutor. They're all rolled into one, and you can't bring a lawyer to a school suspension hearing. And you can't bring a lawyer to a hearing in prison that may put you in solitary confinement. And you can't bring a lawyer to a hearing in a mental hospital. In 1969, a family court judge walks into my office, and she tells us this story. Her role is to adjudicate the cases of kids who are the victims of neglect and abuse at home. Mostly, these are kids who come from single-parent homes, mostly single mothers. They're often unemployed because as a single mother, we live in a country where there's no child care if you can't afford to pay for it. So if there's no child care, you can't get a job. And most of these women are not very well prepared for any kind of work that earns serious income anyway. And a lot of them have other problems. They drink, they may use drugs. So these kids are growing up in rather dysfunctional settings. And a lot of them are out in the streets. Some of them run away, some of them just act out. They're unsupervised. They don't go to school, or if they do go, they go erratically. Nobody reads to them at home. Nobody makes sure that they're doing homework. So these are kids in trouble. Very few of them are committing any crimes, at least not yet. And they're young. They're 7, they're 8, they're 10, they're 12, they're 13. So in most cities, they have something called Children in Need of Supervision programs. Public programs run by the government, or persons in need of supervision. And they scoop these kids off the street, and they basically remove them from the custody of their dysfunctional families. They don't provide money for services to these women who can't afford it. They don't provide daycare or psychiatric services or any kind of help that somebody who's wealthy could provide. So when Bobby and Ethel Kennedy's kids start to get into trouble, they don't end up in these institutions because they can afford tutors, they can afford psychiatrists, they can afford all kinds of help for these kids. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't work. But the children of the poor, and in this country that mostly means the children of the non-white, especially in big cities, are scooped up by a benevolent government, and they're put in these institutions to save them from neglect and abuse. and to help them. So this family court judge who sent this one young 13-year-old girl, her name was Nettie Lawless, as I recall. These are such searing stories that almost 50 years later, when I start telling them, you not only remember the details, you remember the names. And the story she tells us at the New York Civil Liberties Union is that she periodically makes unannounced visits to these institutions where she has sent these kids to see how they're doing. And when she visits this institution, which was called a state training school, she finds that Nettie Lawless, whom she had removed from custody of her mother for reasons of neglect and abuse and put them with the state as a remedy, she finds out that Nettie Lawless has been in solitary confinement for 3 months in a small cell, sleeping on an 18-inch board that's with chains attached to the wall, with one window that's barred and closed, one bare light bulb, and food slipped under the door on a tray, and gets to go out, taken out, twice a day to go to the toilet, and she's been in that for 3 months, and she's 13. And what did she do to get that punishment? She used lipstick. She was 13, she was a young girl, and she started using lipstick and makeup as, I don't know about you, but it's what my daughter was starting to play with when she was 13. And the rule in this place was that you couldn't use lipstick or makeup. So they told her no. So she defied them and said I had a right to use lipstick, and she used it. So they put her in the hole for 3 months. It turned out, after we did a little research, that in just 3 of the dozen New York State schools like this, training schools for kids like that, hundreds of these kids were in solitary confinement for 3 months or more. So we filed a lawsuit, and we ended the practice, and we got her out. But the people in charge of these places were outraged. Many of them said to me that they were longtime members of the Civil Liberties Union. And how could we question their motives? They were trying to help these kids. Now, if that had happened in prison, everybody would have understood that it was an abuse. But because it was happening at institutions run by people who said they were trying to help these kids, it passed below everybody's level of outrage. It turned out that the same thing, of course, was happening in public schools. In the late 1960s, I got a call from a high school student. I'd never gotten a call from a high school student at the ACLU. This was quite stunning in 1967, 68. And the high school student said he was being suspended from school. I said, why? He said, because my hair was too long. You know, that was the time when people started to stop growing crew cuts and started growing long hair. It didn't happen to me, but. You know. And I said, well, how long is your hair? And it was like a quarter of an inch below the top of his earlobe. But the school had a rule that you couldn't have hair that was more than a quarter of an inch below the top of your earlobe. So the principal told him he needed to get a haircut or he couldn't go to school. This wasn't his father or his mother telling him he needed to get a haircut. This was the school principal. And he said, what can I do about that? I didn't know. So I looked it up, and it turned out there had never been any cases, never been any cases challenging the right. And we got calls from female students, from 16-year-old girls who wore pants, slacks, they called them then, to school because it was January and December and it was freezing in New York. And you know, they wanted to go to school with miniskirts on, and they wore slacks. And the principals in almost every high school in New York, and as it turned out all around the country, had this rule that no, that wasn't proper attire for a girl. You had to wear a skirt. You couldn't wear slacks. And they suspended them for that reason. They also suspended boys for wearing turtlenecks. Well, it turned out there was no law that said they couldn't. And there were no cases that ever challenged whether they could or not. Nowhere in the country. But in New York, we discovered, quite by accident, that there was something called the State Commissioner of Education, which was an administrative position in the state government. And the State Commissioner of Education was empowered to hear appeals from people who claimed to have been mistreated in public schools. And this one kid, his name was Dalrymple, D-A-L-R-Y-M-P-L-E, and his parents challenged his suspension from a school in upstate New York or midstate New York because of his hair or his dress. I forget which. And the commissioner ruled that the principal's power to regulate personal appearance was limited. Didn't say so in the Bill of Rights, but the state commissioner ruled that that was the case. That you could stop a kid from wearing cleats on the gym floor because it might bust up the floor. You could stop a girl from wearing a long-haired Angora sweater in a chemistry lab because the Bunsen burner might set it on fire. But you couldn't stop people from wearing their hair the way they wanted, and you couldn't stop people from wearing the kind of clothes they wanted if there was not any demonstrable physical danger. So I said, wow, that's what these kids need. I didn't know that that existed, and it didn't seem to exist anywhere else in the country, and there was no court that had ever ruled on it. But I got a copy of that decision, and the next time a kid called me with a complaint, I told him about the decision, and he said, could I get a copy of that? And I said, yeah, you can come in. And I gave him a copy. And of course, these were all kids ones who were complaining knew about the ACLU. You know, they came from homes where a lot of times their parents were members of the ACLU, or their parents were, they came from elite high schools. They knew how to call us, which many kids who were suspended did not. And they also knew how to find Xerox machines. Of course, most of their parents were professionals, so they could take a copy of this decision and give it to his father or his mother and say, could you make me 10 copies of this? And then suddenly they had copies. So they would go back to school and they would put a cover memo on the decision and say, and this kid actually did this, would say the principal has no power to suspend us for hairstyle or girls for wearing slacks. It's against the law. See the attached decision. And they distributed this not in their classroom, not from a soapbox in the gym, not even during lunchroom in the cafeteria, during lunchtime in the cafeteria. They distributed it at 7:30 in the morning outside the school on the sidewalk before they went into school. So there was no disruption of education. There was no disruption of the classroom. And they got suspended by the principal for distributing seditious literature. He actually used that word. And these kids didn't even know what sedition meant. The only time they'd ever heard the term was in their social studies classes, where they learned about the Alien and Sedition Acts. So they came back to me, and now we had a First Amendment case. And the issue was, and the question presented was, does a student have the right to distribute an official state decision outside the school, before school, in a peaceful way? He can't be arrested for that. So why can he be suspended for it? A cop couldn't stop him. So why can the principal stop him? And we win that case, and that becomes the first time that the First Amendment is ever invoked successfully, at least in New York, to protect the student's right to do so. Well, it was, in today's term, in today's internet world, you would say it went viral back then. Nobody had that term to use, But that decision spread like wildfire all over the city, and it was in the hands of every kid everywhere, and they were all distributing it, and they were all getting suspended, and they were all coming back and going into court. And that's how the student rights movement began. Meanwhile, they kept suspending kids for long hair. I would call up the principal sometimes and say, you can't do that. There's this Dalrymple decision. Well, he says, I don't know why you're calling me. I was a member of the ACLU's Academic Freedom Committee in 1936, and how dare you say that I'm, as if his connection to the ACLU somehow immunized him against a remedy for violating a student's right. And there was one principal who threw a kid off his local football team, his high school football team, because he wouldn't get a haircut. And I called up the principal and I said, you can't do that. And he said, well, no, it's for his health. I said, what are you talking about? He said, well, he has so much hair that the helmet doesn't fit right. And if it doesn't fit right, it doesn't sit in the right position, and it could lead to a neck injury. So I said, well, what would you do if he had a bigger head? And he said, well, you got to get a bigger size helmet. There you go. But it was that crazy, and it was relentless. And pretty soon, everybody understood that this had nothing to do with long hair. And it had nothing to do with slacks on girls. And it had nothing to do with distributing leaflets. And it had nothing to do with pledging allegiance to the flag. What it had to do with was challenging the unlimited power of the principal. Same thing happened in prisons with prison wardens. People were sent to solitary confinement for entering stuff in their own diary that was critical of the prison warden. Bang, solitary confinement. The issue always was, you can't challenge the power of the principal or the prison warden or the chief psychiatrist at a state mental hospital or the person who's the head of reform school. You cannot challenge their power. They are good people who are working hard for the benefit of the people under their control. And what if those people disagree? Too bad. It all became a question of maintaining their power, and that's why the Bill of Rights was invoked, because in the old 18th century terms, these kids were saying, no, there has to be a limit on that power. You can create the curriculum and say what has to be taught in math class or in social studies. You can't tell me how to dress unless my dress is presenting a danger. And the principals went crazy. And the kids were now imbued with the power of these few victories, and they brought more cases. And as the civil rights movement heated up and the anti-Vietnam War movement heated up, a lot of these kids got involved in those movements and began to distribute leaflets about those causes which they cared about. And a lot of them were suspended, and a lot of them went to court. And as most of you know, around this time, in 1965, it was, in Des Moines, Iowa, a 13-year-old girl named Mary Beth Tinker and her older brother and a friend of theirs wore black armbands to school one day as part of a nationwide moratorium, a one-day protest. Everybody was going to wear black armbands to work, and they were going to wear black armbands to school, and it was going to be a silent protest against the war. Their parents were Quakers. This was partly a religious thing. The Quaker Church was helping to organize this, and so they all wore black armbands. Mary Beth and her brother and his friend go into school, and the principal says, you have to remove that armband or you can't go to school. You can't go to school, meaning I am going to take away your right to education for a period of time because you will not remove the armband. They say, well, why is that different from wearing a cross or a Star of David? or a necklace for that matter, that I think is pretty. It's different because it expresses a political opinion that's disruptive. Did it disrupt anybody? It did not. Were the kids disruptive? They were not. Did they make speeches or force other kids to wear the black armbands? They did not. They just wore the black armbands, and they were suspended. The case went up to the Supreme Court, and that becomes the famous Tinker case, which 1970 or 71, that's how long it takes for these cases to go. The Supreme Court rules 7-2 that no, the Constitution does not stop at the schoolhouse gate, that the First Amendment does protect students, and rules in favor of the student's right to wear the black armband. Now, in those days, almost everybody we represented, both in schools and in the larger political settings, were on the left. There were people who favored the civil rights movement. There were people who were against the war in Vietnam. They were almost exclusively on the left. I used to get asked all the time, if you guys say you're nonpartisan at the ACLU, how come you spend so much time defending everybody on the left? And I always used to give the same answer. We spend that much time defending people on the left because the government spends that much time prosecuting people on the left. That we do not select our cases, we select our issues, but the cases are selected by the government. They're the ones who decide whose rights to violate, and we defend whoever's rights are violating. If that turns out to be more people on the left, then it turns out to be more people on the left. Of course, we had our share of defending the First Amendment rights of the Klan and neo-Nazis and all the rest, but by and large, it is always the case that any organization that defends the First Amendment in a content-neutral way is going to have its clients selected not by them, but by whoever it is who's trying to stop the speech. On college campuses today, it turns out to be most of the progressives who are trying to stop people on the right, so that's why you guys are spending so much time defending people on the right. There are a lot of people, when I told some people that I was coming to talk to this group called FIRE, who looked FIRE up on the web and called me back to say, they're a right-wing organization. Those are the same people who used to say that the ACLU was a communist organization. The quintessential thing for anybody who means to defend the First Amendment, whether it's in schools or prisons or out in the streets, is to remember that if the government ever gains the power to prosecute anybody, it gains the power to prosecute everybody. And the reason for that is that the reason why everybody's free speech has to always be defended, even if you hate what they're saying, and most of the time I did, is that the alternative to everybody having the right to speak and publish and write is that the government gets to pick and choose who. And once the government gets to pick and choose who, you don't have free speech anymore. Because the government will always, and the trouble with a lot of people calling themselves progressives today, particularly on the campuses, is that they haven't had very much experience yet. They didn't grow up in the civil rights movement, and they really think that the First Amendment is an obstacle to social justice. They think that because the people they see exercising their right to speech on their campuses that they don't like are against the social justice goals that they themselves have. But if you would have talked to Martin Luther King Jr. in the 50s and 60s, he would have been the first one to tell you that the First Amendment was a prerequisite to the civil rights movement. That when the civil rights movement started, it was all about First Amendment rights. It was about distributing leaflets. It was about having meetings. It was about the Montgomery bus boycott. It was about people marching in the streets for the right to vote. You couldn't have a civil rights movement if you didn't have the First Amendment giving the civil rights movement room to operate. Every social justice movement in America, the right of women to vote, the people who wanted to legalize marijuana, gay rights, even prisoners' rights in prison. Every social justice movement in America, birth control movement, reproductive freedom movement, I don't think there are any exceptions. Every social justice movement in America required the First Amendment to allow it to start, to allow it to build momentum, to allow it to grow, to allow it to flourish, to allow it to pursue its ends. The ACLU was started in 1920 by people who grew up fighting against America's entrance into World War I. And everywhere they went, they were arrested when they decided to meet or distribute leaflets. And they started the ACLU because they knew from bitter experience that you could not pursue an unpopular political goal unless you had the First Amendment to give you room to do it. Margaret Sanger knew that when she tried to start the birth control movement. The people who fought for 70 years in the street to get women the right to vote knew that. All the gay rights activists knew that. Every social justice movement requires the First Amendment. So when people who call themselves progressives today say that they think the First Amendment is an adversary of social justice, they are both uninformed and politically stupid. In the 1990s, I used to speak on college campuses about the hate speech codes. You know who was in favor of the hate speech codes? Black students. So I used to speak in front of these audiences of black students, and they had legitimate grievances. Every day of their lives was a nightmare because of the color of their skin. And these were even kids who were in college. So you can understand why they didn't want David Duke speaking on their campus. Same reason that the concentration camp survivors in Skokie didn't want guys marching through their streets with swastikas. They had been in concentration camps in Poland. Their whole families were wiped out. They didn't want to see that anymore. It's understandable, but it's strategically done. And I never gave those black kids lectures on the First Amendment. I didn't tell them all about the history that I just went through with you. I told them, this is in 1990, 92, I told them that if the hate speech codes they wanted had been in force on their college campus in 1968, their most frequent victim would have been Malcolm X and Eldridge Cleaver, not David Duke. Because the people deciding how to apply those hate speech codes were not them. They would never get to decide. The people deciding were the white deans and the white president and the white board of trustees and the white donors. The very people that they felt oppressed by were the ones who were going to get to decide. When in the early 1970s, the student union in England passed a regulation barring racist speech from the campus, one of the big supporters of that were a group of Zionist Jewish students. A few years later, a Zionist speaker was barred from speaking under that very rule. Why? Because the people in charge decided that Zionism was a form of racism. The Zionist kids weren't the ones to decide. So you can't ever let people in power be making those decisions. And the only alternative to not letting people in power make those decisions is to let everybody speak. And what that means is you got to hear some crap. You got to hear some insults. You got to hear some ugly stuff. And if you've been a victim of that ugly stuff, it's hard to take. But the alternative is to give the power to decide who to speak to people like Rudy Giuliani and Richard Nixon and John Mitchell and Joe McCarthy and Donald Trump. And if Donald Trump had the power to decide who gets to speak and who doesn't, who do you think would get the short end of that stick? The progressives. They would be the first ones in jail. They would be the first ones to be barred. They don't know that yet. And the black students on campuses in the 1990s didn't seem to know it. But that's what the First Amendment is. It's an insurance policy for the powerless. And if it isn't applied uniformly, then somebody has to decide who has power. And that's the most dangerous thing for the powerless ever to allow. And for people who want to restrict speech that they hate, it's important to remember that speech restrictions are like poison gas. You know, you're sitting there, and this bad guy is out there, and you got the canister, and you got the target in sight, and you have the poison gas, and it looks tempting to use it. But when the political winds shift, that gas blows back on you. And that's the political reality and the context in which the First Amendment must function. So I'm glad to break my rule of never leaving my vacation house in July, which during all the years I was at the ACLU, I never did once. I go up there on July 1st, everybody knows it, nobody sees me for 30 days. This is the first time I've done that, and I've done that because I'm proud to encourage you to do what you're doing. I'm glad you're there. Fight on.